So I'm with David Allen Grier. It's a pleasure to talk to you, David.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Carl.
And David is the incoming president of the Computer Society and a professor of international science and policy at George Washington University.
Yes.
And David, I've been very interested in your investment, your involvement in this exciting industry of crowdsourcing. You're clearly seen as one of the thought leaders in the space, and a great opportunity to have a chat with you to get some of your thoughts regarding this emerging industry. So let me start by asking a first question. Obviously, we're interested in the traction that's been made and the adoption of this within sort of organizations and big enterprises and things. Calibrate it for me in terms of where you think this industry is relative to its evolution, and what phase are we in at the moment?
Well, we're still in an early phase. A year ago, I made a statement. I thought we were about 2 or so years from really seeing mature organizations evolve. And I think a year later, I still would make the same prediction. We're 2 or so years. We're seeing some firms that are clearly moving beyond just the great idea that some friends get together and start moving forward and can't bring it to fruition. We see some firms that are moving towards profitability, that have stable lines of income, that have stable products or services they're offering, and those are important steps. It's not clear that those services are necessarily going to be long-lasting or going to be the ones that get profit, but they have started to settle into things that work, that can be delivered regularly, and that customers are appreciating. So it's still an early stage. I would suspect a year from now we will have companies, or a couple of the larger ones, at profitability, which is important for them. But more importantly, it gives those companies a chance to think about services that they can most readily sell without always having to worry about what their investors and their venture capitalists need in terms of their return. So it's an early stage, but we're making progress.
Interesting. So are you seeing any patterns evolving regarding the characteristics of the customers of these companies? Are they serving a similar type of customer base, or is there diversity depending on the type of crowdsourcing company that is providing the services?
I see a diversity, but it's sort of a spotty diversity. You see a clump of a common group of customers here and another clump there. We don't see a large amount of penetration into the Fortune 500. We do see a lot of penetration into companies that are, if you will, tech savvy or used to taking risks. We don't see a lot into sort of the mid-range ones that are considerably more conservative and considerably less likely to adopt new technologies or new ideas such as this.
And is that a function of where we are, or do you think that's going to be representative of where the industry will stay for a number of years?
Well, a little bit of both. Certainly it's where we are, as you undoubtedly have seen. There are going to be industries that are going to resist this and that will not see an advantage to them. And maybe to their detriment, maybe they'll be able to survive without it. But I think certainly we're seeing a pattern that's going to last for a little while.
So obviously, when we think about crowdsourcing, it's a very much a collective term. It can describe lots of things.
Many things.
Many things. So how do you suggest people think about it in terms of how they should segment the different types of crowdsourcing?
There are a lot of different ways of doing it, and you've developed one, and I've been following a slightly different one. I tend to look at it from the process point of view, because first off, that's a background that I have. And second, I think there is a common way of thinking about managing them and developing them, whereas I think an enterprise version is more about the products and value you deliver. Right. And those two things are going to exist together in parallel forever, because they represent the two things this industry has to do. From the process point of view, the most intellectually challenging is how you deal with microtasks. And right now, I think in the popular mind, that's boiled down to little teeny things that one person can do, whereas in fact it's really chains of little teeny things that one can do. That these are things that don't always exist by themselves, but are assembled into large and complex and interesting things that involve database cleaning and recognizing objects and data that are difficult for computers to recognize, and other aspects that add, I think, real value to it, but at the same time pose problems of how do you manage it, how do you get a good labor force to get the work done on time and done accurately in a way that isn't particularly wasteful of human effort.
So obviously, a lot of the excitement and intrigue here is relative to whether crowdsourcing or distributed workforces can form in their own right sort of a distinct and unique category of capability. Okay, and in order to form a new category, there has to be a market that has sort of some competition. There has to be some means to be able to define it, and there has to be some scale associated with it. What do you think the challenges or the barriers are relative to, from the supply side, achieving some of those landmark metrics?
One of the challenges is obviously that we see a wide variety of companies using a wide variety of processes that don't have a lot of commonality other than that they are using aggregated labor, aggregated supply. And they will find commonality and common ways of working together, I think, in the short term because they're bonding together. But soon enough we will start seeing some of their interests diverge, whether they're working on things that are sort of backroom office work that don't require a lot of training or preparation, or whether they're doing expert business guidance or design or something else that requires a substantially educated and trained crowd. Those things are going to start to go their way. I think, though, the fact that they all have an interest in using large numbers of workers, in that they need to think about how to treat workers and how to work with their workforce, is going to bring some of them together and find at least a common ground to work from that point.
So I know one thing that you're very passionate about, and it's something that you're spearheading, is obviously a Bill of Rights for workers. Okay, can you tell us a little bit more about why you think that's important and what impact it's going to have on the industry?
I think in terms of the industry where it is now, it's at a very young and tender state and is largely working under the publicity radar, that there are not a lot of people paying attention to it. Those that do tend to view it as a almost sort of a stunt, like the New York Times about 6 weeks ago published a photograph album of Nazi photographs and asked the crowd to help identify the photographer, the sites, and the places. And within about 48 hours, every piece of information anyone could have wanted was identified. It was a wonderful example of how the crowd can be powerful, but it's not an industry.
Right.
I think once you start getting industry and you start getting money involved, and a lot of money, that you will start seeing opportunities for organizations to behave badly, to make mistakes, for workers to get in situations that they didn't think they were going to be in, and potentially bring a certain amount of negative publicity to the industry. And the industry is at a point where it's raising capital, looking for big customers, and both of those things would stay away if there was a big spat of negative publicity. And I think a workers' Bill of Rights saying, this is what we stand for in work, would give them some protection. And I think in the long term, a more forward-looking saying, we not only protect our rights in terms of payment, transparency, the kind of jobs we give them, making sure that there are people who, if they do not wish to see things that might be considered adult content or offensive or something like that, are protected from it. But also thinking about the educational opportunities, because that's, I think, a tremendous aspect of this kind of work, that it can be used to help people gain skill, to train themselves, for them to learn about more and more sophisticated aspects of work, and to grow and be ready and available for better and better paying jobs.
So you think that from a supply side point of view, that a worker Bill of Rights is going to improve the experience both from an operator point of view in terms of using workers, and from a worker point of view?
And I think it'll protect both.
Do you think buyers? How much do you think buyers think of that as one of the issues that they need addressing?
I think if they're not thinking about it, they should, because the question is, where does the liability end? If there are a group of workers who believe they have been treated badly and are looking for redress, can they go to the person who organized their crowd process? Can they go to the person who purchased the services at the end? And if the industry is relatively has raised only a small amount of capital and the deep pockets are in the customer is going to want to ask, am I protected? And right now, that's not necessarily as clear as it should be.
Okay, so let's pick it up there. So we've been talking about it from the point of view of the operator and the workforce.
Yes.
Okay, and you spoke about it in terms of, the responsibility to obviously govern that workforce and to protect that workforce. Now, what about? I want to orientate the conversation around to sort of the demand side. So
right.
the buyers of crowdsourcing. So
right.
in the first instance, I'm going to stay in the middle for a second. In the first instance, is it possible for large buyers of crowdsourcing services, whether they're large organizations or enterprises, to put the obligation for quality, the obligation for delivery, the obligation for performance on the provider that allows access into that marketplace?
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. And that's all part of the contractual arrangement. The question, of course, is going to be whether or not the liability where it is. The problem is, of course, embarrassment, because as we know in the business world, an embarrassing situation can be very damaging. And how can you avoid that, particularly if you're looking at something like this as being novel and as being not somehow trustworthy to begin with. Crowdsourcing is a form of aggregated supply, and it took a long time for people to understand its complement, which is aggregated demand. And in particular, if you look at the papers of the early people who ran electrical utilities, Samuel Insull in particular, he had to convince his investors that if he took any of these individual customers as part of his grid, he would lose money on them. But if he took 1,000 of them, he would make money, because their aggregated behavior is something he could predict and he could generate electricity for. And it's the same way. Any of these individual workers may be flaky and may not produce very reliable results, but managed properly, the aggregated supply of this labor force can be handled in a way that produces quality work that is ultimately better than any individual worker on it, because they're all contributing to the final product.
So, I mean, obviously, a lot of us are thinking about sort of outsourcing models sort of contextually as a sort of a reference point against it. So obviously, one of the things within an outsourcing model, and I'm thinking about this in terms of the extent to which outsourcing customers are going to move in the direction of crowdsourcing.
Yes.
Okay? So obviously, one of the advantages is that you can contract with an organization, whether it's onshore, nearshore, offshore, and you can put the responsibility to perform on that particular entity. If things go wrong, you sue that organization.
Right.
Okay. Now, I asked you the question in terms of whether you can put the performance obligation on the sort of the intermediary.
Yes, and certainly you can.
But you think crowdsourcing companies will sign contracts with buyers to make them liable for the quality of the service they deliver?
Well, all these things are, a discussion of what you provide and how well do you guarantee it. And I think ultimately it's going to be on the onus of the people who provide the services. And I think it should be. I think the people who purchase these services should at some level not care how they're produced, provided they're produced ethically and produced well. They should care about the quality of work that comes out of it, and that should be the guiding point. And it's, now here I'm temporarily losing my thought on this one, but I think it's important because of that for this industry that's putting together and providing these services, because they're not only aggregating the labor of the crowd, they're aggregating the labor of developing the services and developing the techniques for providing good work. Okay. And they will want to spread that across many, many customers to make sure that their work, that their products, that their ultimate outcome is as high quality as possible, and that will be what they guarantee and what the purchasers will expect.
Okay. So at the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about who the early adopters are from a buyer's point of view, and you were speaking about the fact that, as I know, a lot of the early adopters are sort of the internet savvy companies, the companies with big teams of R&D type of folk. Where do you think we are relative to more traditional organizations in other sectors exploring this, or
and I think most traditional organizations have barely heard of it.
Right.
I think there are a lot of other tech things that they have heard of that they're more interested in. And the model that, as we've been sitting here, that occurs to me is we've all had experience of dealing with call centers that have been outsourced to an area, and often have had experiences that have been not as happy as we might like. And one could imagine a thought process where you start in a call center and someone figures out who you are quickly. You get to a point in the problem where they don't know anything, and they can instantly transfer you to someone who knows a great deal about that problem. And so you're talking to someone that does in a seamless transfer. And that goes on for a while, and they say, no, it's really an installation problem, and instantly you're to a person who knows the most about that. That's the kind of quality crowdsourcing should be able to do. For any part of the service you provide, always get you the greatest quality of labor, the greatest quality of work. And getting that pitch out to those industries are going to be what's going to help to sell it and help them understand the value of it all.
Okay, so when you talk about aggregated demand, are you talking about the intermediary being able to aggregate demand from multiple customers, multiple buyers of crowdsourcing, or are you talking about, do you think we'll get to a point where we're able to go into a large enterprise and we're able to identify multiple opportunities, and that enterprise will establish models and mechanisms to drive that work through one or more crowdsourcing providers?
At this stage, I tend to believe that crowdsourcing is largely going to be managed by independent entities, the small startups we've been seeing here, because I think it's going to take a specialized expertise, not unlike software and software engineering. It takes a lot of effort to get these things to work well, to assure high quality. At the same time, I could see an enterprise client coming in and say, I need these 4 or 5 or how many ever aggregated demand, as you say, for my company. And it may be that the crowd provider has a group of people working on it, and they never really know which part of the ultimate outcome they're working on. But they're providing work on specific tasks that ends up at the enterprise. Some of them will end here, some of them will end there, some will perhaps end up in multiple places. But that you should be able to have a management of your labor and of the ultimate end result so that could happen.
Well, David, great chatting with you. I'm going to ask you one final question. So, as always, let's make a prediction here. So, if we're having a conversation, maybe 12 months from now, hopefully we'll have some before that, but if we're having a conversation and we say, okay, the milestone that we will have achieved 1 year from now, what do you think that milestone might be in terms of how we've determined how far the industry has moved?
The 2 miles, can I do 2?
You can do 2.
I can do 2. I think the first one will start to see crowdsourcing companies making a profit and hence being just a little freer to make their own decisions and follow their own direction. And I think that will be a very important step, as it is for all startups. But I also think we will start to see something in the Fortune 500 starting to take interesting size contracts, not just testing something, but saying, okay, I've got a process and this is the most efficient way for me to do it. And most efficient meaning the least expensive for me, and yet the one that produces the highest quality. And I think those 2 things we will see within a year, and that will mark an important step forward for this industry.
Well, I think if we can achieve both of those, it will be 2 landmark events and necessary in terms of the sustainability of this industry, this newly forming industry, and these models moving forward. So David, thank you very much. Very nice to speak to you.
Very nice to speak with you.
Absolute
Thank you.
pleasure.